What's up, YouTube? Liz is bringing you a video that explores the journey from betrayal to boundaries, focusing on the concepts of a fractured vow, the what-if proposal, manipulation, and long-term outcomes. The central conflict revolves around an attempt at an open arrangement to prevent future resentment, contrasted with the permanent consequence of a chronic STI diagnosis. Enjoy! We begin with the open door from betrayal to boundaries, an anatomy of an open marriage experiment. Mark, 32, male. Mark is the personification of the provider who stayed too long. A successful professional who values stability, he spent his 20s building a life he thought was a partnership. He is patient to a fault, often confusing being supportive with being a doormat. Mark represents the man who finally hits his breaking point, not with a shout, but with a cold, quiet realization that his loyalty was being traded for someone else's curiosity. His journey is one of reclaiming his self-worth from a woman who viewed him as a safety net rather than a soulmate. Elena, 27, female. Elena is a woman gripped by the grass is greener syndrome. At 27, she is terrified of the forever that Mark represents, viewing their upcoming marriage as a cage rather than a commitment. She is charismatic and used to getting her way through emotional manipulation. Elena represents the modern explorer who wants the security of a husband and the thrill of a stranger, convinced she can have both without a price tag. Her downfall isn't just medical, it's the social and emotional bankruptcy that follows when she realizes she gambled away the only person who truly saw her. The late afternoon sun bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their suburban loft, casting long, jagged shadows across the mahogany dining table. It was the kind of golden light that usually made the space feel like a sanctuary, but today, it felt like a spotlight on a crime scene. Mark, 32, moved with a practiced, domestic grace, plating a sea bass he'd spent 2 hours perfecting, braised with lemon, capers, and a confidence he didn't truly feel. He'd even lit the expensive beeswax candles they usually saved for big news, their faint honey scent mingling uncomfortably with the brine of the fish. Across from him, Elena, 27, wasn't eating. She sat perfectly still, her silk blouse shimmering in the dying light, looking every bit the woman he was supposed to spend the rest of his life with. But her gaze was fixed somewhere past his shoulder, lost in the exposed brick of the far wall. She was tracing the rim of her wine glass, a rhythmic, screeching ring of crystal on skin, until her knuckles turned a porcelain white. "The sea bass is getting cold, Elle," Mark said, his voice a soft attempt to bridge the growing chasm between them. Elena didn't look up. She stopped the glass from ringing and gripped the stem so hard, Mark feared it might snap. The silence wasn't empty, it was heavy, vibrating with the weight of a secret she had been rehearsing for weeks. "I'm not hungry, Mark," she finally whispered, her voice cracking like thin ice. "I'm suffocating." "That's just it," she snapped, then softened. "I love you, but I'm 27. I haven't explored. I don't want to wonder what if for the next 50 years. I think we should consider an open arrangement, just until the wedding, to get it out of our systems." The silence that followed was deafening. Mark felt a cold stone settle in his gut. He looked at the woman he'd built his life around, seeing a stranger. "You want to sleep with other people," he stated flatly. "I want to live," she countered. "It doesn't change us, Mark. It protects us from resentment later." Against his every instinct, Mark agreed. He didn't want to be the controlling fiancé. He wanted her to choose him freely. But as Elena began spending her Friday nights out with girls, Mark spent his in the gym or at a local library, reinventing himself in the silence of their home. He didn't see anyone else. He couldn't imagine it. 3 months later, the atmosphere in the loft shifted from cold to clinical. Elena was different, fidgety, pale, and constantly checking her phone with a look of mounting dread. One Tuesday, Mark found her sobbing in the bathroom. The air smelled of antiseptic. "Elle? What happened?" She looked up, her mascara running in black rivers down her cheeks. "I went to the doctor." "Mark, I have herpes. Type 2. The world tilted. Mark didn't move. "We haven't been together in weeks. You're saying the exploration came with a souvenir?" "It was one time. A guy from the gym," she wailed, reaching for his hand. Mark recoiled as if she were made of fire. "The doctor says it's manageable. We can work through this. People do it all the time." "You gambled our health for a what-if, Elena," Mark said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "I'm going to the clinic. If I'm clear, I'm gone." The neon sign of the old anchor flickered, casting a rhythmic blue hum over the corner booth where Mark sat staring into a glass of bourbon he hadn't touched. The air was thick with the scent of stale hops and fried appetizers, a grounding, unpretentious contrast to the sterile, high-end loft he had just fled. Across from him sat Julian, a man who looked like he'd been carved out of granite. Julian had been Mark's best friend since their freshman year of college, the kind of friend who didn't tell you what you wanted to hear, but what you needed to survive. "She's got it, Jules," Mark said, his voice sounding thin even to his own ears. Type 2. From a guy at her gym, a one-time thing, during her little sabbatical from our commitment. Julian didn't gasp. He didn't look shocked. He simply leaned back, the leather of the booth creaking under his weight, and took a slow, deliberate sip of his stout. "I'd like to say I'm surprised, Mark," Julian said, his voice a low rumble. "But I'd be lying to your face. And I've never lied to you." Mark looked up, a spark of defensive instinct flickering briefly before dying out. "You never liked her. I knew that. But this? You think she was always going to do this?" "I think Elena is a consumer," Julian said flatly. "She consumes people. She consumed your time, your money, and your stability. She looked at your devotion not as a gift, but as a safety net that gave her the height to jump off and look for something shinier. People like her don't want a partner. They want a fan club with benefits." "She said it was manageable," Mark whispered, tracing a ring of condensation on the table. "She said people work through it. My own mother told me I'm being cruel for wanting to leave her while she's down." Julian slammed his glass down, not enough to break it, but enough to make the silverware rattle. The sound snapped Mark's gaze back to his friend. "Cruel? Mark, listen to me. She didn't trip and fall into a virus. She went looking for a life outside of yours, while still using your name to pay the bills. She didn't just break a rule. She violated your physical safety. If she had set the loft on fire while you were sleeping inside, would your mother tell you to stay because she was holding the matches?" Mark flinched. The analogy was violent, but it was accurate. "She tried to touch me, Jules. In the bathroom. I felt sick. Like if she touched my skin, she'd leave a mark one could never wash off." "That's your soul telling you the truth," Julian said, leaning over the table, his eyes locking onto Mark's with an intensity that brooked no argument. "You've spent 5 years being the good guy. You were the one who cooked the dinners, who planned the trips, who listened to her complain about a life that was objectively perfect. And how did she thank you? She asked for an open marriage, so she could test drive other men while keeping you in the garage. She's not down, Mark. She's caught. There's a difference." Mark took his first sip of the bourbon. It burned, but it felt clean. "What do I do now? My family is already calling. They're gonna make me the villain. Mark the abandoner. Mark the cold-hearted. Let them." Julian shrugged, unfazed. "Let them talk. People who advocate for a traitor usually do so because they're afraid of the mess a breakup makes. They don't care about your health. They care about the seating chart at the wedding. But here's the reality. You are 32 years old. You are healthy, assuming that clinic visit goes the way we hope, and you are finally, for the first time in half a decade, free." Julian reached into his pocket, pulled out a spare key, and slid it across the table. Mark tested negative. He didn't yell. He didn't throw plates. He simply packed 2 suitcases and moved into a small apartment downtown. He canceled the caterers, the DJ, and the florist. He blocked her number. 6 months passed. Mark joined a hiking group to clear his head and met Sarah. Sarah was 30, a pediatric nurse with a laugh that sounded like bells. She was steady. She was honest. For the first time in years, Mark felt he wasn't walking on eggshells. They fell in love over trail mix and sunrise summits. "You're already gone, brother," Julian said, raising his glass in a grim toast. "Now you just have to stop looking back at the wreckage." For the first time in months, the jagged shadows in Mark's mind felt less like a cage and more like a map leading out. He stood up, left the untouched drink, and followed the only person who had ever truly had his back out into the cool, honest night air. "My guest room is made up. No questions, no talks, unless you want them. You go there tonight. Tomorrow, we go to the loft while she's at work, and we take every single thing that belongs to you. We don't leave a sock. We don't leave a memory. You block her mother, and you block anyone who tries to tell you that you owe a debt to a woman who gave you a biological parting gift." Mark looked at the key. It was a small piece of brass, but it felt like a lifeline. "I feel like I'm losing everything," Mark admitted, his voice trembling. "No," Julian corrected him, pointing a finger at his chest. "You're losing a parasite. You're keeping yourself. And trust me, Mark, one day you're going to be sitting across from a woman who actually deserves that sea bass you're so proud of. And when that happens, you'll look back at tonight and realize that Elena didn't ruin your life. She just exited it in time for you to actually start living." Mark took a deep breath, the weight in his chest shifting just a fraction. He picked up the key. "I'm clear. I'm gone." Mark repeated his own words from earlier. But Elena hadn't moved on. She had spent those months spinning a narrative to their mutual friends and family. One evening, Mark arrived at a, quote, birthday dinner for his cousin, only to find Elena sitting at the head of the table. His mother and sister were there, looking at him with practiced pity. "Mark, honey, sit down," his mother said. "We all make mistakes." Elena was going through a quarter-life crisis. "You can't throw away 5 years over a medical fluke." "It's not a fluke, Mom. It's a consequence," Mark said, staying by the door. Elena stood up, her eyes brimming with tears. She looked thinner, desperate. "Mark, please. I've changed. I know what I want now. I want you. I'll do anything. Therapy, whatever it takes. Don't let some hiking fling ruin our future." "Is that what Sarah is? A fling?" Mark looked around the table. His best friend Dave cleared his throat. "Come on, man. She's sick. You're really going to abandon her when she's down? That is not the guy the first no. Come on, we all make mistakes." Mark yells, "That's it. This was no mistake. This was a choice she thought about. She told me I suffocated her, but now wants me to work through her consequences." The gaslighting was a physical weight in the room. The flying flickers, the friends and family Elena had recruited, closed in. "I didn't abandon her," Mark said, his voice rising with a newfound authority. "She traded our life for a stranger. She brought a permanent virus into our bed. And most importantly, I'm happy now. For the first time, I don't have to wonder if I'm enough, because I'm with someone who doesn't need to explore to know I am." "Mark, you're being cruel," Elena cried, reaching for his arm. Mark stepped back, looking at her with genuine sadness. Not anger, just closure. "I'm not being cruel, Elena. I'm being honest. Something you should have tried a year ago." He turned and walked out. He didn't look back at the shouting or the weeping. He walked to his car, pulled out his phone, and called Sarah. "Hey," he said, the tension bleeding out of his shoulders as he heard her voice. "I'm coming home." The anatomy of the ambush reveals how Elena's allies weaponize guilt, pity, optics, and shame to pressure Mark. They prioritize appearances. A scandal was worse than a managed illness. As Mark pulled away from the restaurant, the silence of his car felt like a sanctuary. He had spent years trying to be the, quote, understanding partner, the one who absorbed Elena's whims and insecurities until he was hollowed out. But hearing his own family advocate for a woman who had fundamentally betrayed his trust and his health was the final snap of the cord. The fallout was immediate and ugly. Within an hour of leaving the dinner, Mark's phone began to vibrate incessantly. "How could you leave her crying like that?" his sister texted. "She's sick, Mark. Chronic. No one else is going to want her now. You're her only hope." Mark deleted the message. The realization hit him. They didn't care about his happiness. They cared about the optics. A canceled wedding was a scandal. A managed illness was a secret they could keep. When he arrived at the small, sun-drenched apartment he now shared with Sarah, the contrast was jarring. Sarah didn't ask for a report. She didn't demand he justify his past. She simply handed him a glass of water and sat beside him on the sofa. "They tried to use guilt as a weapon, didn't they?" she asked softly. "It's like they think I'm a piece of furniture she owns," Mark said, rubbing his face. "Like I don't have a say in who I give my life to." But Elena wasn't finished. 2 weeks later, she showed up at Mark's office. She looked polished, wearing the dress he'd bought her for their 3rd anniversary, but her eyes were bloodshot. "Mark, just 5 minutes," she pleaded in the lobby, loud enough for his colleagues to turn their heads. "My parents, they're cutting me off if I don't fix this. They say I threw away the best man they've ever known." "That's their opinion, Elena, not mine," Mark said, kept his voice low and professional. "I have the medication. The viral load is undetectable, Mark. It's like it's not even there," she hissed, her desperation leaking through the polish. "We can have a normal life. I'll sign a prenup. Anything." Mark looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't see the woman he'd loved at 25. He saw a 27-year-old woman who had gambled a kingdom for a trinket and was now angry at the dealer. "It's not about the virus anymore, Elle," Mark said, and he meant it. "It's about the fact that you had to lose me to realize you wanted me. Sarah didn't need a, quote, rail run with other men to know I was her first choice. She just chose me." The tension in the lobby was thick enough to cut. Elena's face contorted, not with sadness, but with a sharp, ugly realization. She had lost her leverage. The victim card wasn't working. "You'll regret this," she spat, the mask finally slipping. "She's boring, Mark. You'll be bored in a year, and you'll remember what we had." "I hope I do," Mark replied calmly. "Because every time I remember what we had, I'll remember why I left." He walked back to the elevators without looking back. That night, he and Sarah sat on their balcony, watching the city lights. There were no what-ifs, no hidden agendas, and no open doors. Just a quiet, solid foundation. Mark finally felt like he wasn't just living, he was home. 1 year later, the high stakes of moving on. The mountain air was crisp, the kind of cold that makes you feel alive instead of just awake. Mark adjusted the straps of his pack, looking at Sarah. She was laughing, her face flushed from the climb, her hand resting naturally on the small of his back. For the first time in his life, Mark felt settled. No games, no exploration, just the quiet certainty of two people walking the same path. But back in the city, the silence was louder for Elena. 1 year after the open marriage experiment had shattered her world, Elena sat in her parents' kitchen. The mahogany table, once a symbol of the loft she shared with Mark, had been replaced by the plastic-topped island of her childhood home. Her mother was across from her, nursing a tea with a look of disappointment that had become a permanent fixture. "You let him go, Elena," her mother whispered. "The best man you'll ever have, and now he's out there with her." "I made a mistake, Mom. I was 27. Elena snapped, but the fire was gone. Her phone sat on the counter, glowing with a notification. A mutual friend had posted a photo, Mark and Sarah, standing at the summit of a peak, glowing in the sunrise. The comment section was a minefield. So happy for them. Mark finally found his match. Elena felt the familiar itch of the virus, a reminder that her exploration had left a permanent mark. But the physical sting was nothing compared to the social isolation. The friends who had once cheered for her liberated lifestyle had slowly drifted away, tired of the drama and the pity party. "I'm going to call him," Elena said suddenly. "Elena, don't," her mother warned. "He blocked you a year ago. I'll use Dave's phone. He still sees him for drinks. Mark needs to know I'm healthy now. He needs to know I'm still me." The final reach. The air in the brewery was thick, with a tension that food and drink couldn't mask. Dave sat slumped over his beer, his face a map of regret. He had spent weeks as Elena's primary messenger, convinced he was helping "save a family." Across from him, Julian sat like a wall of stone, his arms crossed, eyes tracking every person who walked toward their table. "Mark, I didn't know the extent of it," Dave stammered, looking at Mark, then flinching at Julian's cold stare. "She told me she was suffering. She made it sound like a medical tragedy that happened to her, not a choice she made at some gym. I thought I was being a good friend to both of you by trying to bring you back." "You weren't being a friend to me, Dave," Mark said, his voice steady but sharp. "You were being a PR agent for a liar." Julian leaned forward, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You stood at that dinner and called Mark cruel while he was protecting his life. You helped her gaslight a man who has done everything for you. Do you have any idea how much that cost him?" Dave put his head in his hands. "I know. I see it now. I saw her yesterday, Mark. She wasn't even sad about losing you. She was just angry that she couldn't control the story anymore. She tried to get me to find out where you and Sarah live. She wanted to confront her." Mark felt a chill, but Julian's presence was a shield. "I told her to stay away," Dave whispered. "I told her if she went near you, I'd be the one to call the cops. I'm done, Mark. I'm so sorry I let her use me to hurt you." Mark looked at his two friends, one who had never wavered, and one who had finally woken up to the wreckage. "The apology is noted, Dave," Mark said, standing up. "But I don't need a messenger anymore. I don't need a group dynamic, and I definitely don't need Elena's updates. I'm building a life that doesn't require a defense attorney." As Mark walked toward Sarah, who was waiting by the door, Julian gave Dave a final, warning nod. "Go home, Dave," Julian said. "And next time someone asks you to help them betray a good man, remember the look on Mark's face today." Mark stepped out into the night, the weight of the old circle finally falling away. The summit. The story ends not in a courtroom or a shouting match, but on a porch. A few months later, Mark and Sarah bought a small fixer-upper on the edge of the woods. It wasn't a mahogany loft. It was drafty and needed a new roof. But as they sat on the steps, watching the sunset, Mark realized he had everything he'd once asked for. Elena remained in the city, her name a cautionary tale in their old social circles. She eventually found someone new, but the trust was never quite there. She spent her nights checking his phone, terrified he was exploring, just like she had. The open door she had demanded had become a revolving door of anxiety. Mark, however, had closed the door on that chapter of his life. He looked at Sarah, who was pointing out a hawk circling above. "Ready to go back inside?" she asked. "Yeah," Mark said, taking her hand. "I'm exactly where I need to be." The end. If you enjoyed this story and want Queen Liz to create more content like this, please leave a like and comment to this video. Also, you can subscribe to the YouTube channel. Queen Liz would be ever so grateful. Also, you can find Queen Liz's book, Pocketful of Poetry, formerly a short book of poems, on Amazon.com and Barnes & Noble.